When an avoidant pulls away from you, when they vanish, go cold, disappear without warning, it's easy to think you did something wrong. That you weren't enough, that they simply didn't care. But the truth, the real psychological truth, is far more complex and far more revealing. Avoidants don't withdraw because they don't feel. They withdraw because they feel too much. You need to understand this. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, vulnerability is not just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. It threatens the very system they've built their emotional survival around. Intimacy, to them, feels like exposure, and exposure feels like annihilation. So what do? They run. They shut down. They disappear into their own mind. But here's what most people miss. That withdrawal is not absence. It's pressure. It's emotional overload. The avoidant is not pulling away because they're numb. They're pulling away because they've reached a threshold of intensity that they don't know how to process. And ironically, it's the depth of their feelings that triggers the shutdown. Imagine their silence as a kind of earthquake. On the surface, all you see is stillness. No texts, no calls, no engagement. But underneath that silence is a tectonic shift of emotion, conflict, and chaos. What they're really saying, without having the language to say it, is, I care about you so much, it terrifies me. Now, this might seem backwards. You're probably thinking, if someone loved me, wouldn't they want to be close to me? Wouldn't they move toward me, not away? That's a reasonable question for someone who's emotionally secure, but avoidants have learned through trauma, inconsistency, or rejection that closeness leads to pain. So instead of leaning in when they feel love, they pull away because love is the most emotionally dangerous thing they can experience. This is where things get profound. The avoidance disappearing act, though it looks like rejection, is often a distorted expression of connection. It's their secret way of saying, this matters to me more than I can handle. They don't have the internal bandwidth to sit in the discomfort of love, so they retreat to regulate their nervous system. And they won't tell you this. Why? Because most of them don't even fully understand it themselves. They've spent years, maybe decades, building emotional armor. Now suddenly, they meet you, someone who cuts through that armor like a blade. And instead of leaning into that connection, they hit the internal eject button. But here's what separates the emotionally mature from the emotionally reactive: the ability to see beneath the surface. If you take their silence at face value, you'll assume it means detachment. But if you look deeper, if you really understand human behavior, you'll see their silence for what it truly is: the sound of someone drowning in feelings they've never learned how to hold. That's why so many avoidants come back, because no matter how far they run, love haunts them. Your presence lingers in their nervous system, in their dreams, in the silence they created to feel safe. But by then, sometimes it's too late, because while they were trying to protect themselves from feeling too much, you were outgrowing the pain of not being enough. So the next time you feel abandoned by someone who once seemed deeply connected, ask yourself, is this rejection or is it fear? Because in many cases, their pulling away is not them saying, I don't love you. It's them silently screaming, I love you, and I have no idea what to do with that. Sometimes the deepest expressions of love are hidden in the loudest silences. Learn to read between the disappearances, because that's where the truth lives. You've probably experienced this before. They go silent, disappear, pull away. Classic avoidant behavior. But just when you begin to detach, when you start moving on, they send a message. Not a deep, vulnerable message, no. It's a short, vague text, a meme, a hey, hope you're good. Maybe they watch your stories, maybe they like an old post from months ago. You sit there asking yourself, what is this? What does it mean? Why now? Here's the truth. They'll never say out loud, this is how avoidants say, I miss you. This is how they reach for connection without actually committing to it. For the avoidant, direct expression feels like surrender. Vulnerability feels like losing control. So they communicate in shadows, through indirect gestures, calculated interactions, and seemingly casual digital crumbs. And this is what most people don't realize. Those little check-ins, those random interactions are not meaningless. They're intentional. In fact, for an avoidant, they are monumental. These micro behaviors, viewing your story, sending a one-word text, reacting to your content, are their emotional trial balloons It's their way of poking at the connection without re-entering it. They're testing, are you still there? Are you still emotionally available? Will you reject me if I get too close? It's psychological warfare within themselves. Their head says stay away, but their heart says I still care. So what do? They send a breadcrumb. It's not a mistake. It's not casual. It's the safest way they know how to approach vulnerability without stepping fully into it. This is the paradox. Avoidants crave connection, but they're terrified of the cost. So they create controlled contact, and every time they do, it's not just about you. It's about their need to feel emotionally tethered without risking full exposure. This is the mind of someone who was never taught that love is safe. They grew up learning that vulnerability equals danger, that intimacy leads to engulfment or abandonment. So their brain is wired to feel and flee. Love triggers longing, and longing triggers fear. So they drip feed affection in ways that won't drown them. Hey, most people, now let's talk psychology. What you're witnessing is a form of protest behavior, though it's often misunderstood. In attachment theory, protest behavior is what someone does to reestablish a connection without directly addressing the disconnection. These little moments of outreach, however shallow they may seem, are attempts to feel close again, but from behind emotional walls. It's emotional Morse code. They're saying, I still feel something, but I'm afraid to say it. They're not reaching out to manipulate you. They're reaching out to soothe themselves. But, and this is important, it's not your job to decode every signal or carry the emotional weight of both people. You have to ask yourself, is this enough for me? Because while these breadcrumbs may feel like hope, they can also become chains. If you constantly respond to fragments, you train them to believe that their half-hearted efforts are acceptable substitutes for real connection. And that's not love. That's emotional starvation with just enough crumbs to keep you hungry. So here's the hard truth. Yes, those breadcrumbs are their secret way of saying, I still care. But unless they're willing to walk out of their fear and meet you in truth, it will always remain a whisper in the dark, a message that never turns into a conversation, a pulse that never becomes a heartbeat. At some point, the person who only reaches for you in shadows must either step into the light or watch you walk away from the darkness. You ever notice how avoidants show up just when you least expect it? After the silence, after the space, after the detachment, they return not with a declaration of love, not with clarity or emotional vulnerability, but with a sudden message, a random appearance, a curious check-in. And most people assume, oh, they must have just started thinking about me again. But the reality is far more layered. Avoidants don't come back because they suddenly remember you. They come back because they never stop thinking about you. What you experience as distance, they experience as rumination, emotional obsession, a constant inner dialogue they couldn't escape. But unlike securely attached people who process those feelings and express them, avoidants internalize them, suppress them, and try to control them by withdrawing. Here's what you need to understand on a psychological level. Avoidants process love through fear. When they feel deeply connected to someone, their nervous system doesn't interpret it as pleasure. It interprets it as risk. Emotional intimacy hits their system like a warning siren. So they retreat, not to forget you, but to survive what they feel for you. That silence you hear, it's not blank space, it's internal chaos. And the moment you stop chasing, the moment you stop reaching out, that silence gets louder. Not for you, for them. They may act like they're fine, they may look like they're moving on, but inside something is breaking down. And eventually that internal pressure becomes unbearable. That's when they reappear. Not because they've suddenly evolved or healed, but because their emotional restraint reached a tipping point. The longing overtakes the fear, at least temporarily. So they send the text, they call, they ask how you've been. It looks casual, but it's calculated. That one message, it's the product of hundreds of internal arguments with themselves. This is where things get even more profound. Avoidants believe that love should be earned from a distance, not built through connection. So they convince themselves they're doing the right thing by staying away. But the truth is, no matter how far they run, if you matter to them, you still matter. You live in the back of their mind like a file they never closed. They rehearse conversations. they'll never have. They imagine scenarios that will never play out. They carry you in silence, even as they pretend to walk away. And when they return, it's not because they've resolved anything, it's because avoiding you hurt more than being afraid of you. That's the shift. That's the moment where love outweighs fear, at least enough for them to crack the door open. But here's the critical part. When they do come back, they rarely lead with honesty. They don't say, I've been scared and I missed you. They test, they hint, they send vague signals, hoping you'll do the emotional labor. And if you're not grounded, you'll interpret their return as resolution. But resolution doesn't come through presence. It comes through clarity, through commitment, through growth. You have to ask yourself, are they returning out of love or out of discomfort with their own silence? Because there's a difference between someone who misses you and someone who's ready for you. One soothes their own guilt. The other steps into the responsibility of love. Just because someone returns doesn't mean they're ready to stay. And just because they're thinking about you doesn't mean they know how to love you. Don't confuse their reappearance for emotional courage. True connection requires more than missing you. It requires becoming someone who can actually hold you. A return without transformation is just a loop. And love doesn't live in loops, it lives in conscious choice. Watch what happens when an avoidant hears about someone else in your orbit. You're talking casually, maybe even innocently, about a friend, a coworker, a stranger who happened to compliment you, and you see it. A flicker of tension in their jaw, a microscopic tightening of the shoulders, a quick glance away that lasts just a beat too long. Then they do what avoidants do best. They retreat behind the mask of indifference. They shrug, force a laugh, change the subject, or, if they're truly skilled, turn the conversation back to you with a disinterested, that's cool, as if nothing inside them just shifted. But something did shift. Jealousy, like a silent alarm, just tripped their nervous system. And here's the paradox. Jealousy is one of the most revealing emotions an avoidant can display because it exposes what they're desperate to hide, attachment. Jealousy only sparks where value exists. You don't feel possessive over what you don't care about. So when an avoidant acts aloof while their eyes betray a flash of possessiveness, you're witnessing an unintentional confession. You matter more than I'm willing to admit. Let's break it down psychologically. Jealousy is a threat response. The brain interprets the possibility of losing a resource, attention, affection, status, and triggers cortisol, adrenaline, the whole fight or flight cascade. For securely attached people, jealousy can become a prompt for honest dialogue. I felt uncomfortable hearing about him. Can we talk about that? For an avoidant, the stakes are higher because vulnerability is their kryptonite. Naming jealousy would reveal need, and need feels shameful to them. So the survival strategy is to suppress the emotion, fake neutrality, and mentally downplay the relationship. Don't need her anymore. That's why avoided jealousy often looks like sarcasm or intellectual dismissal. They'll ridicule the person you mentioned, mock the context, or deliver a cold, logical rebuttal. It's probably not that interesting. The goal isn't to comfort themselves with facts. The goal is to reassert emotional distance. By rationalizing the threat away, they can pretend their attachment isn't real. But internally, the limbic system is still on high alert, replaying images of you with someone else, rehearsing catastrophic scenarios where they lose you entirely. The more they tell themselves not to care, the more caring happens in the background, like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. It always pops back up. Now, philosophically, jealousy reveals something profound about the human condition, our longing for significance. Even the most independent persona cannot outrun the universal need to belong, to be chosen, to be irreplaceable in someone's life. The avoidant worldview is constructed to deny that need, to proclaim self-sufficiency, but jealousy is the crack in the facade. It whispers, you are not a lone island. Relationship is shaping you, whether you admit it or not, and that's the growth edge. Because if an avoidant can witness their jealousy without shame, can acknowledge, I am afraid of losing you because you matter, then they stand on the threshold of transformation. Ownership of emotion precedes mastery of emotion. So what do you do when you see that flash of avoidant jealousy? First, don't weaponize it. Calling them out with, see, you do care, only drives the emotion deeper underground. Instead, hold steady, offer safety by staying calm staying present, letting the moment breathe. If they're capable, invite them into a gentle conversation later. I sensed some tension when I mentioned my coworker. How did that feel for you? You're not prying, you're offering a mirror. Remember, secure attachment isn't about erasing jealousy. It's about learning to move through it with honesty and connection. Ultimately, whether they step through that doorway is up to them. Jealousy can be a catalyst or a cage. It can provoke self-awareness or reinforce avoidance. You cannot choose for them, but you can choose for yourself. Ask, does their hidden jealousy transform into deeper commitment? Or does it remain a silent tug-of-war that keeps both of you stuck? Because love isn't proven by who feels jealous. It's proven by who's courageous enough to turn jealousy into genuine closeness. Indifference is the story they tell. Jealousy is the truth breaking through. Decide which one you'll believe and act accordingly. Think about the last time the avoidant in your life did something small for you. Filled your gas tank without asking, sent over a playlist when you were stressed, or quietly left your favorite coffee on your desk. You probably thanked them, and they probably shrugged it off with, it's nothing. But here's the psychological x-ray. For the avoidant, those micro acts are not nothing. They're covert declarations. Words expose them, actions cloak them. So they speak in the grammar of service because it lets them love without having to confess they're loving. By this language of doing instead of saying. At its core, an avoidant nervous system equates verbal intimacy with risk. Words mean conversation, and conversation invites follow-up questions, expectations, and the terrifying specter of dependency. A task, though? A task is clean. A task has edges. Tighten a screw, send a link, pick up a prescription, mission accomplished, vulnerability contained. Acts of service function as emotional decoys. They satisfy the innate drive to connect while keeping the spotlight off the heart. Many avoidants learned this script in childhood homes where affection had to be earned. Maybe love arrived only after chores were finished or grades were perfect. Maybe praise always came wrapped in a critique. Good job, but next time do it faster. So they internalize the message, productivity equals worthiness, caretaking equals safety. Fast forward to adulthood and you find them lubricating relationships with favors instead of feelings. It's not manipulation, it's muscle memory. Now look closer at the pattern. They don't brag about these gestures, they underplay them. That humility isn't always modesty. It's camouflage. Drawing attention to the act would blow the cover off its emotional payload, and the avoidant prefers you focus on the utility, not the intimacy. Notice too how the tasks often appear precisely when words would normally be required. After an argument, on an anniversary, on your bad day at work, where a secure partner might say, I know you're hurting, let's talk. The avoidant repairs your laptop. The gesture is real, but the silence around it is just as telling. Philosophically, this raises a fascinating tension about love. Aristotle argued that virtue resides in action. Love as praxis can be more authentic than love as proclamation. Yet action without acknowledgement can slide into ambiguity, leaving the receiver nourished, but still hungry for clarity. Emotional starvation can happen on a full stomach of good deeds when the heart remains untranslated. So what do you do with this knowledge? First, witness the intent without inflating it. Their acts are genuine care, not empty currency. Receive them, thank them. Let the nervous system associate connection with reward rather than exposure. But then, if reciprocity matters to you, invite them gently into the dialogue they fear. I appreciate what you did. It made me feel cared for. I'd also love to hear what drove you to think of me today. You're handing them a bridge between action and articulation. Some will cross it, others won't. Your task is to discern the difference between reluctance and incapacity, between a learning curve and a brick wall. And to the avoidance listening, understand that service is an admirable dialect of love, but relationships thrive on bilingual fluency, doing and saying. The habit that once protected you is now the ceiling on your connection. Every favor is an opportunity to drill a tiny hole through that ceiling and let language pass through. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that intimacy is worth the tremor. In the end, love disguised as duty is still love. But only transparency turns duty into devotion. Recognize it, honor it, and decide whether it is enough. Have you ever noticed how an avoidant becomes suddenly available when you start pulling back? You create space. You stop initiating. You begin choosing yourself. And like clockwork, they start orbiting again. More present, more curious, more consistent. But here's what most people don't realize. This isn't just coincidence. It's not just timing. It's a deeply wired emotional response to perceived loss, filtered through a lens of psychological defense and survival instinct. Avoidants don't respond to closeness the way securely attached people do. In fact, closeness feels dangerous to them. Not because love is inherently threatening, but because intimacy exposes them. It forces them to face emotions they've spent a lifetime repressing. So when you're pursuing, when you're available, they feel pressure to perform, to reciprocate, to risk. And because their default programming is to protect, not connect, they retreat. They create distance, not out of malice, but out of fear. But here's the twist. When you detach, when you stop reaching out, something in their internal world starts to unravel. That distance no longer feels like control. It feels like abandonment. And abandonment, even for the avoidant, is a primal wound. It triggers the very fear they were trying to avoid by pulling away. That's the moment they start feeling the gravity of your absence. Not because they've suddenly changed, but because your silence created emotional contrast. When you were present, they could convince themselves that love was optional. When you pulled back, they realized connection was never guaranteed. That realization ignites something ancient in them, not just a longing for you, but a confrontation with their own suppressed vulnerability. This is why you'll often see avoidants become more expressive, not with big romantic declarations, but in subtler ways. A check-in message, a just thinking of you, a comment on your post. It's their version of knocking on the door, testing to see if you're still there. They don't always know how to say, I miss you. So they say it by circling you again. Now, this is where the philosophical depth becomes important. We often misunderstand detachment as punishment. But in relationships, detachment is clarity. It doesn't hurt them because you're playing games. It hurts because you're shifting the emotional dynamic. You're no longer the one holding the door open.